This morning's briefing. We've got apologies from Grant for the day, and I've heard from Shane, who will be a bit late, as will Megan. Want to hand over now to the team who are going to talk us through some of the metrics. DIA is working on sharing council metrics across the country to be able to help communities understand how rates are spent and to be able to compare performance between councils. So we're ensuring that we understand our own numbers, which I know we do here, but we need to think about how we can communicate that well with our community over the next few weeks before the stuff is released. So we're going to spend some time today, both in a public session and in a PX session, because until the data is actually released by DA, we won't proactively release that data. So Steve, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Sam. Good morning, councillors. And Sam, you've done most of my introduction for me, so I appreciate that. Thank you. Whilst we get the presentation up online, the purpose of today's first briefing for council and the community is to provide the operating context. The DIA benchmarking data is going to be a relatively hard set of numbers without a story behind it. And that becomes really important when we're putting that information into the public domain, that it's important that the context in which we're operating in is recognised. As the fastest growing council in the country, we need to be able to put the context around what the growth looks like and what growth means for us. But it's certainly when you get compared to somewhere like Southland District Council, which is one of the comparative councils we will be measured against, the operating context is fundamentally different. And so today, what the staff have done over the last 2 to 3 weeks, especially in the context of the DIA data, is to identify some other comparisons and some other operating sets of data that might be useful in putting the DIA benchmarking data into a context and into a position so we can understand it and that the community can understand it and see how we fit in there. So the slides are up on the screen. So we're going to go to the second slide. So Rob, if you can press the button there. So this just gives you the overview, and Sam's touched on the fact that last year council was advised by the DIA that the benchmarking data was going to happen. This is the first, like I said, it's going to be largely numbers based. And this will be the first of a series of benchmarks for local government in the country that will come out. So we're now going to, between Rob and I, we're now going to go through some of the contextual slides that the team have put together, just so that when the DIA benchmarking data is released, that the information that we put around that as a council for our community, we'll talk to you about that component today. So Rob, next slide.
Just before I move on to the next slide, I just wanted to clarify that this is based on the New South Wales Office of Local Government. So DIA, the government, are basically using that and reiterating what Steve has said. It's quite sort of blunt information in terms it just provides data. It doesn't provide any context about those different councils. And so as we're trying to do today, is just provide a little bit more context to inform you for when that data is released. Do you want me to? Yeah. So Infometrics have done some work around sort of what proportion rates actually make out of all the taxes that an average household would pay. And it is relatively small. And so a large part of that is actually made up of sort of income tax, GST, etc. And that's quite useful to consider in terms of the context of the sort of services and the communities that we serve. Probably the main thing I want to sort of illustrate is that Selwyn has been a fast-growing council, is continuing to be a fast-growing council, and will continue to be a fast-growing council. To put it in perspective, Selwyn 20 years ago was slightly smaller than Ashburton is today. 10 years ago, we Timaru, we were the size of Timaru in terms of population as they are today, so about 49,000. So we've grown a lot, especially in the last 10 years, and we're operating in that kind of environment. Queenstown is the only other council that is, Queenstown Lakes is the only other council that is actually growing close to us, but a lot aren't. And so this comparison with other councils is quite useful to put it into a bit of context. We are a fast-growing council. Tauranga is up there because in terms of actual population, their population has grown by 59,000 over the last 20 years. Our population's grown by about 53,000. So it's sort of similar in terms of actual population increase.
So we've included these councils, and these councils don't all fit into the category about what we will get benchmarked against in the group around the DIA data. So it's really important that story, and that we're measuring growth councils against growth councils, not just because we're a small to medium rural council. Historically, I don't think that rings true as much now as it did maybe 10 to 15 years ago. So that's the reason for these comparatives.
So just building on the fact that we are a fast-growing council, we've looked at average rates per person to give a bit more of a clearer picture as to how our rates compare with our neighbours, but also with other high-growth councils. And we are, based on the 2023-24 annual report, one of the lowest average rates per population. It's probably worth noting here that a lot of the data that is being collected is has been collected by others will be focused around rateable units. It's quite a difficult comparison because rateable units will vary quite considerably between urban and rural councils, and so it makes it harder for that sort of comparison to be taken. That's why we've used population, so people can actually see, if I was living in one district, what I would be paying on average. Continuing that story is looking at our debt, obviously with growth, funding infrastructure, essential infrastructure to enable that growth. A lot of that is funded through debt initially, and then repaid through development contributions or rates. And as you can see from here, our debt level is one of the lowest. On a good note is that on the 8th of May, this year, Fitch Credit Rating Agency have rated Selwyn District Council as AAA+, which is an excellent rating. Some of the data from other councils may be a little bit more historic, but this is quite a very good, and confidence in our ability to deliver and do what we're doing.
The next slide that's going to come on shows and represents the story that we've been sharing with council for a while now, which is around we are spending the bulk of our capital expenditure on those essential services, on the core services that keep our communities connected and thriving. And our roading and waters from our annual report is around 81% of the expenditure. And you can see that this is a really tough comparison because a place like Christchurch, which has significant capital infrastructure, is outweighed to some degree because they've also got a lot of community infrastructure that is being built, including swimming pools and recovery to the earthquake. So when you're looking at those sorts of things, these comparisons have to have that story behind it. But this is, I guess, representing some of the data that will be presented, but just giving you that context of how we stack up against those other growth councils as well.
In terms of sort of personal costs, so as the district grows, there are more demand on our services, and so we're growing as well as a council. But relatively speaking, with some of our peers on a cost per population, we are one of the lowest personal cost per population, even compared with some of the high growth councils. And so I mean, this is a good comparison. a lot of the data that will come out is just, as I said earlier, is just basic numbers. So it's really hard to understand what the context is of those different councils. So that's really the key message here.
So that's the last slide in this pack. I guess, Sam, we're happy to take any questions now around that operating context or any other questions about this data.
Thank you. Really interesting comparison and really important to be able to give some context to just the number, because the number by itself never really means much. And your examples around showing the Christchurch compared to ourselves, that's why Christchurch will be telling their story around why, because they have got completely different circumstances to many other places around that capital spend, as we've got different reasons for some of our outcomes. You talked about rateable units and as compared to population, and how some councils or some other bodies might choose to compare on a rateable units basis. Can you just explain a little bit more why that's not a fair comparison, or why it's harder to actually run that as a comparison?
Yes. So in a more rural district, you'll have more, generally speaking, agricultural units, less residential, less commercial, industrial. In a district like ours, we've got a mix of both agricultural, industrial. We've also got a lot of development sites that are actually being land that's been improved and added. So we've got a number of those, and also a growing population with residential units. Somewhere like Christchurch will be predominantly residential and commercial units. So it makes it very difficult to compare, because the value and the number of those different units will vary quite considerably, because rateable units is basically the number of rateable units. So a residential area will have a lot more than a rural area.
And is that sort of the same as titles? So like titles is the rateable unit area?
It can be, but it's generally it's something that is assessed for the capital value for that area, and then that's the base for rates. Because
I guess that will also be determined by how New Zealand was colonised and settled, because those areas that had larger blocks of land, which are now larger farms, compared to places where the rural areas have been lots of smaller titles brought together, a farm covering the same area might be in 5 rateable units in one district compared to 1 rateable unit in another district, even though it's the same amount of land. So I think that's also where the comparison can be quite difficult. There's historical reasons for it too.
We use population also because it just makes it easier for people to do that comparison. Saying if I live in Selwyn, or if I live in Waimak or Christchurch, I can go, well, on average, how does that compare? There are differences, obviously, because of property values, etc. But it's nothing's perfect, but it's probably a reasonable measure.
Thank you. Are there any other questions councillors got of the data that we have, or pieces of the puzzle that help to explain the context for our numbers that you think should be included in this, that might be helpful for us as this is released in about a month's time, early July, I think is the DIA's date. And as part of the release, there will be the ability for a council link to come with the DIA data back to us, so we can share this, and it's not just going to be whatever the DIA wants to say at their front page, which is the numbers. There'll be this ability to share behind. So if there's anything that you think needs adding to it, now's the time to be able to speak about it. Or if you walk away from this meeting and think, oh, I had wondered about that, please talk to Steve and stuff about that.
I'll clarify a couple of things here. The DIA have invited councils to actually put their own narrative around these numbers, so they're encouraging councils to communicate and share the story with their communities, so that the numbers that are provided through their benchmark have a description of why, because the numbers don't tell you the why. It's our job to tell the why, and so again, your feedback today will help us tell that why. The second thing is the DIA have indicated that they were going to release this next week, but they have deferred it for somewhere around a month, just to add in some extra data that's coming out of all of the annual plans that are being adopted at the moment. So we're not entirely sure of when the release date will be. We obviously planned this on the basis that this was next Monday. We're not entirely sure what the DIA benchmarking changes will look like, but in the next briefing we'll give you a run through of what we currently know.
Steve, Sophie.
Yeah,
Welcome
thank you. Thanks. Thanks, team. I think my questions probably apply regardless of whether it's this data or some updated data, although one of them was going to be how soon after, like, again, thinking that it was going to be 30th of June, my one question was going to be how soon do we think we might be able to get like one that was a similar set of data that's based on sort of 2024, 2025 data, because if you release it on 30th of June, it's automatically 12 months old. So one question was around on the growth and rates slide and, well, basically those first slides with the bars. For me, just being because I'd like to know where the information comes from or what date it refers to, the population, I'm presuming that's June 2024, but it doesn't say that. We've got average rates per person, and that's the only one that's got a year. So like we don't know which 20 years, because somebody's going to ask that. And it's helpful to just put it out there so that that's one less thing to feed the confusion or feed the questioning. And another question was on the ones with, so there was capital expenditure per rateable unit and personnel costs. The other slides include Ashburton as well, but they're not on those two slides. And that would probably be helpful, being that they're one of our neighbours and that we've got them on some slides but not others. Thank you.
Yep, no, very good points. And I should have made it clear that it was an error in terms of putting the source on the population, that it was coming from Infometrics regional economic profile of council population. It is to 30th of June 2024, so that we're comparing the annual report with the population, etc.
And in regards to the Ashburton data, I think, Rob, you've made the note to me that some of that data wasn't easily extractable out of Ashburton's annual report, or we couldn't find it easily. And so I think that's the reason why Ashburton don't appear on a couple of those slides. But correct me if I'm wrong, Rob.
We just haven't quite done it yet, so that's why.
Thanks, Sophie. Deborah.
Thank you. Look, my question's also on the growth rates and depths. And I would dearly love my rates to be only $1,128,000 as an average. Are we just talking the general rate component here? Or are we talking the average of general rate, UAGC, and targeted rates? Because they impact on our rates, probably more severely than just what we pay in a general rate component. And often, when you actually see the value of a property that is given in our annual plan as examples, I struggle to find where the targeted rates are actually included. So I want some clarity around what rating structure are we actually talking about here when we're talking about 1,128. So that's one question.
So it's total rates, revenue, divided by the number of people living in the district. So it includes general rates, targeted rates. So it's taken from the annual report, 2023, and it's...
So that's per person?
Yes.
So that's not per rateable property?
No, it's not rateable property.
Okay, so where do I find for clarification on this? I have total, what have I got? Total debt per population. But where do I have it that this is per person on this growth chart? That it's per per person living in the district. That's what we equivalently pay. I've got a message down the bottom where it says debt, right? But we've got nothing with growth rates and debt that this is on per person, unless I've missed it somewhere. Because I would read this as looking at it, population, average rates, we've got per person, right? 2023-24. But the reality is, when we actually go to pay our rates, or the rateable people who pay the rates, I think there needs to be some reference in there about what the average property pays. And the reason why I'd like that in there is because it gives a true reflection of a rural property versus an urban property versus a commercial property. It's a breakdown of what is actually included in the rates, the people who actually do pay. Because when we're looking at population, that is including every single child that may move in and out of the district or be here. So
Deborah,
I just want to clarify that. The next question
and we can answer that for you because
Okay.
it clearly states on each of the pages it's per person. And the briefing that we've had this morning talks about per person. And the clarity was that actually if we don't do it per person, then we can't easily compare and tell the story about why we're different than other councils, because some councils charge water like us based on the water that you use. Some councils charge water based on the capital value of your property, and if you just use a per property rate, it doesn't work in the same way. And so the clarity that the team is trying to show here is easily comparable data across different councils.
And if I may add to this point too, this is not data that stands on its own. It is there to support the DIA benchmarking data, which will do, I think, the other part of the equation that you've asked for, Councillor Hassan.
Okay, so the next question, I guess, is if we're going to actually move water and wastewater into a WSCCO, will that impact on these values per person?
Yes, it will impact on the values, but it won't impact this report because this reports to the end of the financial year 2024. We imagine as the next cycle of benchmarking data comes through, that we will continue to update the benchmarking data and update our story in context.
Okay, now the next question is, I guess it's from a commercial perspective. Given that we are close to Christchurch and given that another area borders, we border on Christchurch, how many other councils are in a similar situation where they border on an actual city, they're a standalone, with regards to, I guess, the sharing of resources with regards to being close to a city, because a lot of people who live and work in Selwyn and vice versa they're dormitory. They move into the city and we all share the city's resources and they come out and share our resources. Because we're so close. So when we're comparing ourselves against the city, is there any other city, like Auckland and Tauranga or Auckland and Hamilton, or are we unique in this situation with regards to our demographics?
I think to answer that question, I think the other comparator would be Wellington, when you've got a number of territorial authorities that border that and a lot of the workers travel into Wellington. However, what we've identified is the growth profile, and that's the key context for us is Selwyn's the fastest growing council in the country, and that we've tried to find comparative growth councils who are experiencing similar growth. Wellington, I don't think, would fit that category as well, but if you think that there is merit in us looking at some of the data from the lower North Island, that might work. Also the Nelson Tasman region, Nelson's a city and they've got the Tasman district on its border, but again I'm not entirely sure that the growth profile aligns as close to what we've got, and obviously being the fastest growing council, everyone's behind. And so how we find comparators that actually put our data in context is challenging because we don't have easy comparators.
Okay.
And there's a couple of others, Deborah, too, like Waipa around Hamilton, or Western Bay of Plenty around Tauranga, or Waikato District around both Hamilton and Auckland. All of the major cities have smaller areas next door to them that have traditionally been rural, that have grown really quickly. I mean, Auckland would have, but it's now all Auckland City, so all the growth in Pukekohe and further south is now just included in the Auckland data, but that would have 10 years ago been shown quite differently.
Okay, it's just trying to understand the growth comparison of what we're comparing ourselves with our neighbours. So if you go to Ashburton, it's more rural. Timaru, I would argue, is more rural as well. So it's just trying to find where we sit within that growth comparison, being next to a major city, probably the second in New Zealand. So
And I think the data, Deborah, I think when we had it reported to us when the census came out that we were the fastest growing, that Queenstown was just below us. I think we've grown 29% in 5 years, and Queenstown was still in the 20s. And then you had to drop down to the mid-teens for anyone else in the country. So there's no other comparator that's even close to us as far as growth goes. Everyone else, other than Queenstown, is only growing half as fast is what we are. So that's why it's been difficult for the team. But if you've got some other ideas of the comparisons you particularly like, and that's the reason for this conversation today, let's thank you for raising that with us.
I think we can certainly take on board the points and make sure we explain that really well in the narrative on our landing page. But thank you for that.
I know I've turned my light off, so the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because being so close on the boundary of Christchurch, we could actually be seeing similar to a suburb of Christchurch, with a line separating us. That didn't used to be the case, but that's the impact of growth. And maybe for the future, we actually need, or DIA needs to consider how, the future of local government with regards to that sort of impact where it does happen. I know it happened in Auckland with regards to the amalgamations that happened in Auckland. We had the 89 amalgamations.
Deborah, sorry, we just don't have microphones on to go into that. Lydia.
Thanks. I won't dwell on this too much, but it's just around the average rates per person and I guess the timing around that. Because, when we're saying we're the most affordable council in the data that we have here, actually we're heading into the next financial year, which is a 29% increase on that. So I think it actually puts us quite comparative with a lot of the other councils if we're looking at sort of forecasting forward for that. So I just wanted to confirm the DIA will do rateable unit in their information?
So that they're not going to provide that. As my understanding at this stage is, they're not going to provide that kind of level of detail. They'll just talk about average rate increases.
Okay, so then I just wonder, is it worth us having the rateable unit as well, like having both as comparable data?
We can do that, yeah. But as I said, it probably will need quite a bit of an explanation, is that rateable units do vary quite considerably, as there is going to be a text around sort of
and
population.
I acknowledge that, some of our rural are 50k, some of our urban are 5k, and so that's the trouble, isn't it, with these numbers, is there needs to be a lot of context and narrative around the why. So I'm just trying to think about the best way to give a clear big picture on this stuff.
Thanks, Lydia. Shane.
Tērā tātou katoa. Welcome back, Sophie. Good to have you back. Thank you very much for the information and the slides. Clearly, with a critical mind, you can see why. It clearly explains the why at 165% growth. The close comparison with Queenstown and the comparison between average rates. There's a bit of a difference here, but that's on page 9. But page 10. Capital expenditure per rateable unit, the comparison with the other Christchurch and Tauranga say that other is 62% and other is 48%. Clearly, that explains again the why around the justification, I guess, of the rates increase. And whilst I understand that DIA or this information is a snapshot of our current situation, I wonder when we get to the point where whether it's relevant to the information provided, because it'll be in the long-term plan, when and where the balance comes in what year, whether it's relevant to this. When does we get to sort of the balance of being other? When we've caught up, basically. Yeah. So I just wanted to point out that, yeah, thanks very much for the information. It's obvious. Thank you.
Thanks, Shane. You're talking about the 19% other on the pie graphs?
No, yes, page 10 on diligent. Yeah, 90% other. So when you compare it to Christchurch and you know why, and to Tauranga, there's a big difference in the other there. Yeah. Clearly, roading and waters at 81% is where most of the investment and the need for capital and rates increases are being spent at the moment. If I was a ratepayer and I was looking at this, when can I expect that to be more balanced? When my rates come down? When we have caught up, what does that look like and when?
Thanks, Shane. Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. I apologise if this was asked while I was out of the room, but personal costs. Obviously, we can see there's a massive difference between ourselves and Christchurch and Queenstown Lakes. Obviously, a skyrocketing ahead. Is there a bit more information around the reasonings why, I mean, compared to Christchurch, which has a huge, much bigger database, why they're really low on the graph compared to ourselves, and obviously Queenstown Lakes, which is just about double. Is it a narrative because of the growth we require more staff for that, for consenting processes, or is this to do with pay rates? I guess it would just be nice to pad out a little bit of information to describe the requirement around this, give it some context.
I might let Rob talk about how that data is actually put together, but I think the challenge with comparison, and if we put ourselves against Christchurch City, for example, they have per capita probably the highest number of pools per population in the country, and as a result they've got a number of lifeguards, swim instructors, customer service representatives that are all paid at that living wage standard, and so they're a head count. They add to the FTE component, but that's the challenge here, is that we're dealing with budget and headcount and FTE, and they've got a huge amount of people paid at that frontline level, whereas we don't have that same nature of service. And so when you're trying to compare a city council cost bar against a Selwyn District Council cost bar, you then have to get down to explaining how many different pools do they operate compared to us, how many different frontline services do they run compared to us, and then what does the growth look like. So it's really challenging to get into the nuance. That's why some of this data is, we're putting it there and we're comparing ourselves against some other people, but it's just numbers. So if you think we need to do a little bit more in explaining that, I think we can take that on. But Rob, tell us how that numbers come about.
So it's based on FTEs. So that's one way we can actually compare numbers of staff between the different councils, and each council in their annual report has identified what their full-time equivalent staff are. So that includes all their part-time and casual staff, etc. And then it's the cost. It excludes costs of councillors, mayors, etc. So it sort of excludes that. So it's actually the operating costs, and again, that's taken from the annual report. And then we've basically taken that total figure to then work out what the cost is per population, just again to aid some comparison. But Steve's right. Depending on the council, the levels of service that are offered, that can vary quite considerably. And each council will have its own story to tell, but we can provide a little bit of context between that and acknowledge that there are differences between those councils.
And so this data that's the data that DIA are going to release will just be the number of cost for personnel, without comparison, without context, without putting it into a per population base. So that's why we've done that work, because unless you go to compare rateable units as has been raised or by population, you just can't compare what those costs look like across different sized organisations. So thank you for the work on that. Sophie?
Yeah, sorry to ask another question. We've got per person in some places and per population in others. And I know in my head, population means everybody in the district. So we've only got one population. So maybe I've got that wrong. I'm just wondering what when somebody's reading it, why do we have two different ones, and how do we explain why there are two different PERs? If we're actually still talking about dividing a total sum of money by the number of people in the district. So why is sometimes it referred to as per person and why sometimes it's per population?
It's something we can make clearer, really, in terms of sticking to one term by making it clear that it is per person that lives in the district.
Malcolm?
Yeah, well, these figures are very interesting, aren't they? I look forward to the public getting a hold of them. I particularly look forward to the local paper getting a hold of them. And it doesn't really fit with the government's narrative at the moment, does it? When we've been told by the Prime Minister at the local government conference last year that we are funding far too many nice-to-haves and we're wasting ratepayer money, when we have 81% on roading and waters and 19% on, I guess that's the nice-to-haves. So I very much look forward to this coming out. It does give us, even at a per-person level, a benchmark. We keep getting thrown in our face the 14.9 and the 14.2 and how high up they're going, but it's a matter of comparing apples with apples and looking at your neighbours. And yes, there will be a lot of groans from the rural sector, but they are a business, and they've got to remember that rates come off their bottom line. Those in the residential don't get to claim their rates as a business expense against their taxes. So these things all need to be put into comparison. I welcome these figures, and I look forward to seeing how the government tries to manipulate them.
Thanks, Malcolm. Thank you, team, for presenting that to us. I think that's the end of the public workshop for today. So